here today with Sam Cheney. Thank you very much, Sam, for coming in today and talking a little bit of a farewell podcast episode. But since you did your, I guess, last presentation to the school, and I unfortunately had to miss that episode for a JV lacrosse game, I got to watch it, and we've been talking these last couple of weeks here before you head off and go on to the next phase of your life. But yeah, I'm excited to get you in here and talk a little bit about your poetry and some of the poets who have really been inspiring you lately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thanks.
So I guess the first thing I kind of want to start with before we get into poetry is we talked a little bit in the library about Don DeLillo, who I've been reading. And one thing I've been thinking about, not even having to do with his writing or his story at all, but just style. And I want to talk to you about style, I think, to start off the podcast, because the way I've been thinking about style since reading his work is that I can read one of his sentences or extract one of his sentences from this book and know that it's his work. I think every single one of his sentences has something about it that is unique to his style. So I think my question or point of conversation here is, like, what is style to you? And I'm sure you talk about style a lot with poetry. I mean, it's a major piece of it. But how do you go about thinking about that?
Sure. I mean, style, it's interesting that you picked DeLillo, because I do, early on in the semester, I'll give my students a handout that's effectively, 4 different voices, 4 different writers sounding like what they sound like. And DeLillo is someone who absolutely, right, sounds like himself and is particular, right? His sentences are, they're kind of long. His voice, he often appeals to theory or theoretical things or art history in the same sentence that he's, swinging for the fences. Sometimes, like, literally, I mean, we might talk about Pafko at the Wall, which is one of his books that I think is kind of a perfect novella. That'll be my first recommendation for the podcast episode.
There we go.
Read Pafko at the Wall. It's perfect, 70 pages. But, I mean, style essentially is how you say the thing, right? Content is separate from the voice or the style. And it's a choice. And that's really what the first thing that I do when I'm talking about it with students is to sort of ask you to realize you can say this in so many different ways, and you have so many different voices. We all do, right? The way that I speak with my friends, the way that I talk to my neighbor, the way that I talk to my mom is different from the way that I answer a question in class, is different than how I'm talking on this podcast, right? And so getting people to think about all the different voices and fields of knowledge that they have, right? Whether that is video gaming or how you talk online is a good way to get people to think about style. Is, what do you sound like when you're writing an Instagram caption? What do you sound like when you're commenting on or DMing somebody? Versus how do you sound when you're talking to your dad after work or when he gets home, right? So we all have these different voices, and we also have these different ways that we like to make ourselves sound. So style is in, at first, kind of choosing that. How do I want to say it? And then you get into things like sentence lengths and how long, do I like to go? DeLillo often has really, really long sentences with a lot of subordinate clauses and things like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think another person I think about, and I introduced this book on the previous episode, is String Theory by David Foster Wallace. And I've been trying to get into David Foster Wallace recently because I think I'm going to tackle Infinite Jest this summer, hopefully. I mean, it's a big, I don't know, have you read Infinite Jest?
I haven't.
Yeah. I'm it's an undertaking, but we'll see how it goes.
Yeah.
But something I like about his writing is he'll almost mimic a boring lecture, right? And you can tell from that style of writing halfway through, you're like, I'm bored to death right here. And that's, that's what he's going for. That's his point. So I think in addition to just the style of a sentence and understanding who the writer is from the way that they construct a sentence is, like, if you're thinking about telling a story, you're almost trying to match that style with your point that you're trying to make. Like, this is, what David Foster Wallace does a lot is he'll have a huge paragraph, trying to mimic what it's like to be at a tennis match. So it's almost back and forth, and you can hear the sounds being made in the audience. Right. And I really like that. I appreciate about his writing is it matches, I guess, the environment that he's trying to write about.
Right. And different authors. I mean, by the way, David Foster Wallace, massively influenced by Don DeLillo. We don't get him without DeLillo. And a number of other authors, obviously, like Thomas Pynchon. But I think what's interesting is you will end up sounding like the writer behind these voices, right? Don DeLillo has all these different narrators, and they're not the same, right? These characters are often quite different from one another. But there still is, this sort of inherent way that I think you come to feel about delivering information. And that really is, I guess, what we talk about, like when a writer finding her voice, right? Is the fact that despite this novel being about, characters in 1800s England, and the next novel being about a family in Brooklyn, the authors writing them still like to sort of mete out information in that particular way. So I think you get that in both of those guys. Yeah.
I think we talked about this a little bit on the last podcast episode, but I often like to think about writing and try to compare it to art, because I think that's visual and something that my students can see when I explain it. And I almost think of a writer's style as like the brushstrokes of a painting.
Yeah, it's
like,
how you're applying the information.
Like Van Gogh, you could tell just from a subsection of one of his paintings that's him. And I think that's amazing. And that's when you know that you really have your own unique way of expressing something.
Yeah.
But it's very difficult to teach. It's like I just got done grading a pile of essays from my students, and some of them, they just don't work because the voice hasn't been delivered. There's nothing quirky or unique coming through the writing.
Well, one of the hardest things as a young writer, especially somebody coming through a school like this, is you are taught and encouraged to sound a certain way, right? That the AP English voice is what you're going for in most of your papers, kind of if you're lucky, right? And again, it's important to realize that it's a choice and that it's not a default. That when you sit and write whatever, even if it's a paragraph for your science class, right? You still can choose to make that sound however you want, and you can have fun with it, or lean into the, theory, or lean away from it and be really idiomatic and conversational. But it's like sometimes you haven't been told that. So
Interesting. Well, let's get to some of the poems that you brought in today. I know you've got Merwin here. I don't know too much about him. Why'd you choose him, and what is this collection you brought in?
Yeah. So Merwin, I chose, this is W.S. Merwin. And the book that I brought in, which I totally do recommend, this is called The Essential W.S. Merwin, which is kind of a collection, a selected poems of his whole career, which was massive. He was writing poems for like 70 years. And Merwin is a poet that I really love, and that I kind of realized that I haven't been talking about that much here at Gilman, in the halls or with my students or the people that come meet with me. So I wanted to shout him out. I was torn. Another book that I'm going to recommend, and a poet that if I could hold you all hostage and do this for 4 hours, we'd read a bunch of Gwendolyn Brooks, and we'd read some W.S. Merwin as well. But this book is the one to get for Gwendolyn Brooks. She has a selected as well, but it's called Blacks. And this is her almost collected. It has most of her poems in it. I was going to read The Rights for Cousin Vit by her, and Memorial to Ed Bland, two really great kind of eulogies, poems in memory. But I just love Gwendolyn Brooks, and I wanted to shout her out as well. Merwin, I'm choosing for a couple reasons. One, because I'm going to read this poem, Berryman, and I get to recommend two different poets because of that. Merwin studied with John Berryman, who's one of my all-time favorite poets. And so this poem, which is also about writing and kind of the teaching of writing, I thought would be a perfect fit for this context. So kind of passing along knowledge that has been passed along to us from William Stanley Merwin, who got the knowledge from John Berryman, who he studied with when he was, beginning as a writer. So maybe I'll just jump right in and read this poem, Berryman. Merwin, often his poems, and the next one I will read is incredibly short, very mysterious, and his poems are pretty bite-sized. They're awesome. Like, this book is perfect to keep on your nightstand. If you want a 10-second poem or a 40-second poem, and to just kind of reorient your life or your morning or your night, you can flip in to basically any page and land on something that's really, truly worth reading and thought-provoking. This poem is weird for him because it's almost like a memoir, and it's a little bit more prosaic than almost anything he ever wrote in the rest of his career. So this is a poem called Berryman. John Berryman was a mid-century poet. He's grouped in sometimes with the confessional poets, and he was a character. If you want to see what John Berryman's about, go on YouTube and look up Dream Song 14 by John Berryman and watch him reading it. And if you like that, you've got a fix for life. The video is crazy. He's half drunk. He was an alcoholic. He's a true sort of romantic poet in these ways that I think sometimes we like to think of poets as troubled and passionate. And he's kind of, he is a figure that has that kind of temperature about him.
Now, what's his background, and where did he and Merwin meet?
So he and Merwin, Berryman was a teacher, like most career poets, right? He collected paychecks by teaching at a summer workshop here or the University of Iowa for 2 semesters there. So Merwin was at Princeton, and Berryman was a TA there. And so Merwin was in John Berryman's workshop. So that's where we'll pick up.
Love it.
Berryman. I will tell you what he told me in the years just after the war, as we then called the Second World War. Don't lose your arrogance yet, he said. You can do that when you're older. Lose it too soon, and you may merely replace it with vanity. Just one time he suggested changing the usual order of the same words in a line of verse. Why point out a thing twice? He suggested I pray to the muse, get down on my knees and pray, right there in the corner, and he said he meant it literally. It was in the days before the beard and the drink, but he was deep in tides of his own, through which he sailed, chin sideways and head tilted, like a tacking sloop. He was far older than the dates allowed for, much older than I was. He was in his 30s. He snapped down his nose with an accent I think he had affected in England. As for publishing, he advised me to paper my wall with rejection slips. His lips and the bones of his long fingers trembled with vehemence of his views about poetry. He said the great presence that permitted everything and transmuted it in poetry was passion. Passion was genius, and he praised movement and invention. I had hardly begun to read. I asked, how can you ever be sure that what you write is really any good at all? And he said, you can't. You can't. You can never be sure. You die without knowing whether anything you wrote was any good. If you have to be sure, don't write.
Wow, that's amazing. That's cool.
It's cool, right?
I like the he snapped down his nose with an accent I think he had affected in England.
Mm-hmm.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and he has a very weird mid-Atlantic voice. He's of this generation of people who, especially, who were raised on the East Coast, that, he has an accent like an actor in a 1930s movie, and Berryman is not British, but there is some of this strangeness about his voice that's really wonderful to listen to.
Yeah, I mean, he really captures the character, and I don't know anything about Berryman. I haven't seen him. I'm gonna watch the video, but
Yeah.
but he really captures his character, and I think he really expresses a lot about what teaching is like, and the kind of importance of teaching,
Hmm.
and how one piece of advice that you give a student
Hmm.
can really shape the way they produce work and think about things.
Hmm. If you're lucky. Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
So I like the way I like the lessons that are imparted here, and it's an incredibly memorable ending. How can you ever be sure that what you write is really any good at all? You can't, right? If you have to be sure, don't write.
hmm,
It's good advice.
yeah,
Yeah. And it's good advice to remember, I think, as a young writer, because we're so driven toward uh positive feedback. We're so hungry as young people for that gold stamp from our teachers or our workshop leaders or a magazine. And a life in art is long, and it's always interesting to hear from people who have in some way or another made it, right?
hmm,
That uncertainty never goes away.
hmm,
And so if you have to be sure that what you're doing is good, um, you can get burnt out. So it's important to remember that that's not why you do it.
yeah. It's got to be a really tough conflict to battle with as a poet or an
Hmm.
artist, because in some ways, and I was talking about the college recommendation letters with my students and
Hmm.
the personal essay and writing about yourself, and it's
Hmm.
really the same thing, because in some ways you're trying to write something because you need to and you love it and it's your art and it's your creation, but there's also like you want to get published and you want to
Hmm.
share your poetry and you want the stamp of approval of your book on the shelf,
Hmm.
right? So there's that conflict that you probably are thinking about all the time.
Yeah, definitely. And you can't help but want certain things, right? You can't help to, desire any sort of push that says keep going. And I do think that that's an important role that teachers and mentors play, is saying, this is good, keep going. Um, but you have to want to do it because you want to do it, right? You have to write because you want to write. You have to decide that you want to be. It's the same as anything else, right?
Hmm.
But uh, the accolades or positive feedback is not gonna be an end in itself forever, I
Hmm.
think.
Yeah, and I think part of good mentorship and good teaching is, if you're lucky, again, kind of breaking open that mental block
Hmm.
where everything is to an end, it's to a grade, it's to
Yeah,
college.
yeah,
Whereas it could actually just be the joy of writing poetry or writing an essay, that you enjoyed the process of doing it.
yeah,
You're proud of what you've done, and you don't need my 29 out of 30 fraction on the
yeah.
top of your
No,
page to tell that to you.
yeah, you do it because whatever it is, you love knot theory and you want to keep thinking about it,
Hmm.
or you love biology. And the questions, I think, are more salient, and the quest,
Hmm.
things you're looking for. That's what will keep you doing this thing sustainably.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you for sharing that. I've never heard that poem before. Now I want to learn more about both these poets,
Yeah.
Merwin and Berryman. Um, cool. I also really like the part in this poem about passion, and
Hmm.
how um, he had the great presence that permitted everything and transmuted it. In poetry was passion. Passion was genius, and he praised movement and invention. And I think that's really true about a piece of writing, is
Hmm.
your passion for the subject or the joy that you're finding when you're writing something somehow finds a way to come through the writing.
Hmm.
And sometimes that's hard to pinpoint, but it's almost under the surface of a work of art that the artist has like enjoyed or has a passion
Hmm.
for producing this.
Yeah, I'm glad you're saying this because it's reminding me of something I wanted to say on this podcast, which is a line that I tell my students always, which is that a poem is not a retelling of an experience. A good poem is an experience, right? Poems are experiences. So rather than just sort of retelling us what it was like to have a teacher and be John Berryman's student, we need to experience this in our, for ourselves. We need to feel that. And I think that's a really important distinction. I think a lot of people think of poetry or all creative writing as, sort of the author retelling some things that happened to them, or coming up with an experience, even fictionally, that they're then retelling in a convincing way. But the poem itself is the thing. It's like listening to a song, right? You experience it as it goes. And so I think that that's important to remember, is that, like, a poem isn't saying someone left me and now I'm sad. It should feel like an experience on from And maybe actually that'll bring me, I'll read one more. I'll shoehorn one more Merwin poem in. This is an incredibly short poem from much earlier in his career, called Separation. Separation. Your absence has gone through me like thread through a needle. Everything I do is stitched with its color. So there's one for you. An incredibly sad poem, but I think part of why it works is because we feel that, right? And it's fresh. It's exciting. It's not just saying something happened or I am sad, but it is making that come alive for me as I read it. And something, right? The metaphor here. Metaphors give us the ability to feel concepts, right? Like a metaphor makes something like love or separation become something that is tangible to us, right? And so your absence has gone through me like thread through a needle. Everything I do is stitched with its color. I think, I think you envision that as you read it. I think you might see that color or that thread as a certain color, right? You may have pictured it as red or green or something. Also, the idea that everything I do, you're here, right? You're not even you, but your absence is here, is everywhere. It's really, really interesting. So it's quite theoretical, but when I apply it to this physical thing, a needle and thread, now I'm watching it happen. I'm watching a theoretical thing happen. It's crazy.
Yeah, I like this a lot. I think what does it for me with this poem is the last word, color, because in some ways the what the poem is about, that word defies what the poem is about, because you think of separation, absence, and loss as almost like gray, or a dark feeling. But the last word is contradicting, I think, that assumption about what absence is. And I think, I think that almost brings me to another question that I wanted to ask you today, because I read the poem that you wrote, and you might have to help me with the title, but about the flood at your house, and then what you're going to name a daughter, or what the narrator of the poem is going to name daughter, Claire or Colette, right? And I think the way that that last stanza defies the rest of the poem, it brings it to life a lot more for me in a similar way that this poem, the word color, defies my expectation of what separation and loss is.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. In that poem, it's making a figure, right? Absence is the opposite of a thing being around, right? Absence is a void, but he's making that void something that is present, right? That is the very thread that so yeah, very interesting. Sorry, follow me, get me to the second part of your question. I got too excited about the Merwin.
The question, I mean, it really has to do with this poem that I really like. What is it called? Where you're
thinking about having a child while my house is flooding.
Yes. Can we read that one? I know you read it before, but I like this one a lot.
Yeah, I'll be happy to. Thinking about having a child while my house is flooding. Atomic science suggests some years are shorter. Time not elastic, but simpler, just going by more quickly, leaving us with less than the less we could fairly expect. Somehow it's also backfilled the pipes and exploded out the bowl of the toilet. An exact radial blast 3.5 feet high. The toilet paper roll, sink, mirror, hand-dyed hand cloth, pink shower curtain, framed photo of a tulle veil floating in wind against a blurred brown horizon of oak trees, all evenly soaked. We don't know how much of this we'll get. I suck up the pond we've dammed off using a shop vac. The precious things we could save, we rushed upstairs like a moving day in minutes instead of hours. Shop vac, then towels, then shop vac, then towels, and industrial dehumidifier. There will be plenty water left for the cave crickets. I would hope for a girl. We could give her a French name, like Claire or Colette.
That's awesome. Yeah, see that you kind of sucked me in for the first 6 stanzas of this poem, and then at the end it just flips everything around.
Mm-hmm.
And I really like that about a poem. It's sort of like what is the poem? I've wasted my life almost, right? Like that line changes everything about the poem and all your expectations for what it's supposed to be about.
Right. Yeah. And titles can help with that, right? I mean, my title is telegraphing what's coming. And then I'm hopefully giving the reader enough time to have forgotten so that you have this feeling of, oh, okay, we're back, right? I knew it was coming and then I forgot. It's very satisfying to build in that kind of distance from an expectation. So your titles can buy you big swerves in poems like that. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it can be quite satisfying. It doesn't always work, I know, some students, I'm sure you've taught the James Wright poem too, and they're ticked off. But it can be satisfying. I mean, it's one thing that I think we love in writing is, God forbid we'd be really surprised by the place a piece of writing has ended up.
Right.
That's one thing I really love. Second recommendation of the podcast, or my fourth or whatever, but if you want a really wild book of short fiction, Jesus' Son by Denis Johnson. And he is kind of swinging for the fences with every ending of all of those stories. He's breaking the rules. He's doing things that they tell you, don't do this in the workshop, and going somewhere quite crazy with like his last page or two. And for me, that's like an incredibly satisfying reading experience because it's defying my expectations. And it's taking risks, right? It's going outside of its lane or its stated path as a narrative. So yeah, I hope that this ending, or some endings that I do like this, I hope that it has a feeling like that.
Yeah. What is your favorite story in that collection? I know the most famous probably is the car crash while hitchhiking.
Yeah.
But then there's Emergency, right?
Emergency is insane. I mean, the first half of Emergency is so insane. I feel like, I think I'll never forget the first time getting to that last page or two of car crash while hitchhiking. And then also, again, without spoiling anything, the last sentence.
Right.
He's really, like I said, swinging for the fences with these endings. So maybe, but those are, I think, two that really are amazing.
Yeah. And I think you remember the first time reading his work because it's so shocking and so different from anything you've ever read before, right? Like,
another also just great example of voice. If you want narrators that don't sound like Don DeLillo, Jesus' Son is a good place to look.
Yep.
Yeah, and the ending of Emergencies is so good. It's like, if you're listening to this on Spotify, I'm beaming right now, imagining the ending, the last paragraph of the story Emergency. So
awesome. Thank you for the recommendations. So maybe a couple more poems or poets that you want to talk about. We'll keep this episode a little bit shorter because, as we said, I think hour-long episodes can be daunting for some people, and I think I think we can try a shorter episode. Sure.
Here. Do you have something that you want me to read or talk about, or should I just pick one now? I'm happy to do either.
Let's see. Well, I really like Block Island, and I know you worked on that for a while.
Hmm.
But I also like the senior speech, and I think the senior speech is fitting for this episode and for Gilman. So
Yeah,
maybe
yeah. I
maybe
mean,
let's do that one.
this is my goodbye episode, so
Yeah.
I'd be happy to read it. This is a poem. There, a type of poem or a genre is an occasional poem, which is, a poem written for the convocation of a school, or the poem that is written for the president's inauguration. Right, that's probably the most famous occasional poem that we see. And after 4 semesters of teaching here, I had been kind of dragging around some lines that I started thinking, I could maybe, it might be nice to sort of to write a poem, or give my students a poem that I could leave them with. So I said this in my assembly, but if you've been in a class with me, um, you will learn about poetry and fiction writing and screenwriting. But I also like to throw in, usually really surprise, without any forewarning, like life lessons.
Hmm.
I like to teach my students how to jumpstart a car, and um, get them to think about uh, things like that. And I guess I can't help it, and many teachers can't help, imparting a little bit of wisdom, or things that we think might matter or make you a more conscientious person.
Hmm.
Um, and so this is kind of a cento, which is like, cento is like an ancient Italian mashup poem, where it's made up of lines from other places. So if I just listened to 92.3 and wrote down 15 cool lines and then arranged them into a poem, that's a cento.
Hmm.
And so this is kind of playing with that form for the first half of the poem, of stuff Cheney has said or taught. So this is senior speech. You can delete the app by holding down 3 seconds. Positive to positive, negative to ground. Leave the shower wet to leave the bathroom dry. Choose a song and stick to it. Get good. Use your blinkers. Leave enough space for the next car. Smythe's right. Be the dancing guy in the festival crowd. Death will touch your life. We're here to feel things. Breathe in when the bell rings. Every band needs a laptop or a keyboard player. You'll go off to college. Someone in their dorm room will play you Joni Mitchell's Blue or Frank Ocean's Blonde, and the songs will stop being songs and become a scary portal to future you. Your teachers may stay put or go away. Get out of here. You'll be old soon enough. Honor us by remembering and forgetting. Read for pleasure. Write me a postcard.
Love it. So good.
Thanks.
I really like. Well, I like a lot about this poem. Well, I think the scary portal to a future you is so good, and I think it really puts it nicely about how, like, songs evoke certain memories.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's what you're talking about. There is these, 2 songs: Frank Ocean's Blonde, Joni Mitchell's Blue. And when you hear them in the future, like, time becomes different, right? Because songs bring you to different places. And I think that's something that high school students understand, right? Like, they get that. Sometimes I have my students write a personal essay with the first line being, "I remember the first time I heard blank." Yeah, so I like how you put that in there, because it's relatable for anybody, but especially high schoolers.
Yeah, and cultural objects kind of give us ourselves too, right? Like, you never know when you're going to see a movie and all of a sudden, you're not just seeing another movie,
Right.
but you're seeing, something is opening up and you're changing as a person because of that. So yeah, I like the way that time collapses when you revisit something like that. But when you're hearing it for the first time, you may not know that yet. right? There's also this sense that the first time I sat in my dorm room playing an album by Joni Mitchell, I didn't know that this whole fork was developing right then,
Yeah.
right? That was my future opening up.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that's really thrilling. That's one of the reasons that it's so exciting to be the age that all of our students are.
Yeah.
Is those things, those like really important things are happening, or about to.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, so I'm excited for you all, students.
Well, Sam, thank you very much for bringing these poems today and for sharing some of your work with us. We're gonna miss you here at Gilman. I mean, it's been great to get to know you. Hopefully, we can connect, and you'll still be in the Baltimore area a little bit. But
I'll be around.
Cool.
Yeah, and thank you, Cesare. Yeah, and thank you to all of the teachers and faculty and my colleagues and friends here. There are so many of you that have made these 2 years awesome. And I'm really thankful for the people I've been able to meet, and thankful for the chance to be here. So yeah, thanks very much.
Awesome. Appreciate it. Thanks
Yeah.
for coming in.
So let me close with this Lucille Clifton poem.
Yes, perfect.
I had brought in one last one, and I don't want to miss my chance.
Yep.
So yeah, Lucille Clifton, if you don't know, Lucille Clifton, and you're listening, is I would say, probably the most, or among the most important poets attached to Baltimore or related to Maryland ever. She's a really important figure of 20th century American poetry, and she lived in Baltimore for much of her life and in Maryland for much of her life. She was the poet laureate of Maryland in the 70s and 80s for a while. She lived in West Baltimore, and there's a house there now, the Clifton House, that has been reopened as sort of an arts center. So everyone should check that out, the Clifton House. She read at Gilman. To the best of my knowledge, or my detective work, I'm thinking December of 1993. I found a VHS tape recording of her Writers at Work reading. So I'm getting that digitized with the archives and hoping that we can dig into that. Or I can, at least pass it on to everybody in the archives in the library before I leave. But Lucille Clifton taught at St. Mary's in Southern Maryland for years. And this poem, Blessing the Boats, is a poem that she read. It's dedicated. It was at a convocation. So this is one of her sort of occasional poems for a goodbye, and specifically a goodbye to students. So this is Blessing the Boats by Lucille Clifton at St. Mary's. May the tide that is entering even now the lip of our understanding carry you out beyond the face of fear. May you kiss the wind, then turn from it, certain that it will love your back. May you open your eyes to water, water waving forever. And may you, in your innocence, sail through this to that. Lucille Clifton rocks.
That's great.
Go get a book. So thank you. Thanks, Jake.
Yep.
Thanks to everybody at Gilman, especially my students. It's been awesome. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thank you, Sam.
Yep.